I call the member Marama Fox.
Tēnā koe te mana whakawā. Ka ranga mai ko te Kawerau wā Maki. Ko te wā nui a tiriwā, mai te kore ki ngā tai arata taura, ko rangi hina, ko whangaparawa, ko mahurangi, nā Maki te mana me te rangatiratanga. Tēnā koutou i ngā āhuatanga o te wā. I te rau kawakawa, iri te whare aitua. He piki rau kura, he kōtore huia, ka whaitia, ka whātia, ka ngaro ki pairau. Ka ngaro whakaoti atu, āpiti hono tā tai hono, ko te hungamate ki te hungamati. Āpiti hono tā tai hono, ko te atau te hunga ora, te kanohi kitia, ki a tātou anō tēnā koutou. As we gather here this morning, we grieve the passing of a son of te Kawerau Maki, Eru Thompson. 4 years ago, on the 18th of February 2010, it was Eru Thompson who was pictured in the symbolic pungi with Sir Doug Graham, the then Crown negotiator for the agreement in principle. It is so fitting that as this significant claim reaches its first reading, we acknowledge the incredible efforts and sacrifices made by all those who have carried this claim. After more than 150 years of annihilation from your whenua, and a negotiations process stretching back nearly 7 years, this is a very significant day for the descendants of Tāwhia ki te rangi. A day signed with sadness, a day touched with meaning. Te Kawerau wā Maki originally lodged claims with Waitangi Tribunal nearly 30 years ago. But the history dates back over centuries. E te mana whakawā, we welcome to the House today te Kawerau wā Maki, the descendants of the famous Chief Maki, and his wife Rotu, who in the early 17th century migrated with their whānau from Kāwhia to what is now the Tāmaki Makaurau region. In time, the children of Maki and his followers dispersed throughout the southern Kaipara, te whenua roa o Kahu, Hikurangi, Whangaparawa, Mahurangi, Matakanakana, Pākiri, Aotea, and te Hau Turu o Toi. Together they are known today as the Kawerau Confederation. Nau mai, haere mai, ki tau whare paremata. Te Kawerau wā Maki held their land and resources under collective tribal custodianship. Their rangatira exercised authority over their tribal domain and the surrounding sea. They enjoyed a highly mobile lifestyle based on a cycle of seasonal resource gathering. With intermarriage, they soon had interests throughout the wider area settled by the Kawerau Confederation. However, and this is where our story becomes laden with heaviness, intertribal warfare and the arrival of Europeans had a devastating toll on the tribe, especially during the 19th century when numbers dwindled. European contact in the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought the tragedy of Rewherewa. In 1825, the Kawerau wā Maki then suffered major losses in battles and with other groups were forced to exile to the Waikato. In 1835, they returned to Waitakere and the South Kaipara under the protection of Tainui Ariki te Wherowhero. By 1840, the Kawerau wā Maki, although reduced in numbers like other tribes of the region, were resident on their ancestral land. They continued to exercise kaitiakitanga over the vast natural resources and focused on the Waitakere coastline between Piha and Muriwai. At the time, the Kawerau wā Maki had little direct contact with the Crown. However, pre-treaty land transactions between other iwi and early European settlers saw the annihilation of the Kawerau wā Maki lands. From 1841, the Land Claims Commission investigated the pre-treaty transactions. However, when resolving them, the Crown failed to consider the Kawerau wā Maki's interests. The Crown granted settlers lands and retained a surplus of land for itself. In 1841, the Crown purchased an extensive area called Mahurangi and Omaha. This area included land that Te Kawerau wā Maki held shared interests in, but true to form, Te Kawerau wā Maki was not consulted about the sale. Nor did the Crown provide adequate compensation and reserves when it later learned of Te Kawerau wā Maki's interests in the area. Between 1844 and 1845, the Crown waived its right of preemption, allowing private individuals to negotiate directly with Māori. However, the Crown did not apply the regulations it had established to protect Māori. Through these transactions, Te Kawerau Maki lost land in West Auckland and around the Upper Waitemata Harbour. The Crown took with one hand and gave with another, providing land for settlers and gaining control of the local rich timber sources. In 1853 and 1854, the Crown turned its attention to acquisition of 100,000 acres in the Waitakere Ranges, deep in the rohe of Te Kawerau Maki. That's right, 100,000 acres. These purchases included the Hikurangi block for £1,100. The heavily forested block was estimated to include 12,000 acres, but was not surveyed at the time. It was later found to include 54,141 acres. Again, the deed was not signed by any leading Te Kawerau Maki rangatira. No reserves were set aside for Te Kawerau Maki in the large Hikurangi block. Te Kawerau Maki received £50 as a final payment for Hikurangi and 2 neighbouring blocks. E te mana whakawā. From the mid-1860s, the individualisation of title made Te Kawerau Maki lands, including their reserve lands, more susceptible to partition, fragmentation and alienation. This process continued throughout the 20th century for a very limited areas of the land that Te Kawerau Maki had left. Between 1920 and 1951, the Crown acquired the remaining Te Kawerau Maki interests in Kōpiro Nui and Puketapu blocks in South Kaipara. The Crown did this by compulsory purchases and Public Works Acts, taking sand dune reclamation and despite Te Kawerau Maki protest. The Crown's actions and omissions have meant that today Te Kawerau Maki is virtually landless, with no marae or urupā of its own, as has previously been said. The Crown's failure to ensure Te Kawerau Maki was left with sufficient land for its present and future needs was completely and utterly stalled. The tribe has completely and utterly stalled the tribe's social, economic and cultural development. Furthermore, this failure has undermined the ability of Te Kawerau Maki to protect and manage their taonga and wāhi tapu and to maintain spiritual connections to the lands. Today, e te mana whakawā, the Crown acknowledges that for too long it failed to appropriately respond to Te Kawerau Maki claims for redress and justice for its breaches of the treaty and its subsequent failure to protect the lands reserved for iwi. Today, we finally begin to lift the burden of grievance for Te Kawerau Maki, a day which is long overdue. As we start to make those next tentative steps towards forward, the Māori Party stands to acknowledge the trustees of Te Kawerau Iwi Tribal Authority Board. You have acted so diligently and unrelentingly on behalf of your tupuna and the present descendants, and you have secured a future for generations of Te Kawerau Maki yet to come. We take this moment to acknowledge you. George Winikere Taua, Te Warena Taua, Miriama Tamariki, Hamuwera Taua, and Ngārama Walker. Anō nā koutou e whakapauwera i whakapaukaha ka tū ohu te māhunga kai mua i tā koutou aroaro. Finally, I want to leave the last word to your own Eru Thompson. On that auspicious day of the signing in 2010, Eru summed up the importance of the settlement when he said, "It's taken almost 30 years for the government to admit that my people are the tribe of the region. That is just a step leading up to the completion of the claim. It was never going to be exactly what we wanted. The issue is now about moving forward and developing a future for our grandchildren. Moi mai rā, Eru. Your work to this point is done. Ka waihua anō te toinga mahi. Kia mātou te hunga ora, te hunga tūtuki i o wawata. Nō reira, e te whānau, te Kawerau Maki, tēnā koutou kairaro.
I call the member Kelvin Davis.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker.